The polished marble floors of the Dubai International Airport's first-class lounge glistened like a mirror beneath Victoria Chandler's designer heels. Every movement she made was deliberate, every accessory, from the silk Hermes scarf to the glittering diamond-studded timepiece on her wrist, chosen to signal power, wealth, and exclusivity. At 44, Victoria had crafted her image with surgical precision, a walking advertisement for old money and corporate dominance. She barely acknowledged the respectful nods from staff as she sipped her vintage champagne, scrolling through her phone, updating social media with a recent yacht party off the coast of Capri. The lounge attendant approached with a polite bow. "Miss Chandler, your flight to London is now boarding. Priority access is ready." Victoria gave a tight smile, rose with practiced grace, and made her way toward the private boarding bridge, far removed from the chaos of economy boarding queues. As she stepped onto the aircraft, the scent of premium leather and polished chrome filled the first-class cabin. The crew greeted her warmly, ushering her towards seat 12A, her usual window seat. Victoria took her place with the comfort of someone who had done this dozens of times, immediately pressing the call button. "Champagne? Krug, if you have it," she said without looking up, already typing a message to her assistant regarding boardroom arrangements and a pending acquisition that would push her firm into a new tax bracket. She glanced up only when she caught a motion in her peripheral vision, someone placing a worn leather laptop bag in the overhead bin beside her. Her smile faltered. The man who took the seat beside her wasn't the usual type she encountered in first class. He wore a plain grey t-shirt, the kind you'd pick up on sale at a department store, and jeans. Not designer denim, but faded, wrinkled, everyday jeans. His hair was a bit unkempt, and he hadn't shaved, giving him a casual, almost rugged look that felt entirely out of place amid polished businessmen and tailored suits. Victoria's first thought was that he had taken the wrong seat. Her second was that he must have gotten bumped up from business class, one of those unspeakable complimentary upgrades the airlines sometimes handed out. She watched, incredulous, as he calmly opened his tablet and began reviewing emails. It was then that she turned sharply toward the nearest flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, raising a perfectly manicured hand, her voice sharp enough to draw attention from surrounding passengers. The young attendant Sarah hurried over with a professional smile. "Yes, Miss Chandler?" Victoria pointed a discreet finger at the man now seated in 12B. "There seems to be a mistake. I think this gentleman is lost. Surely he's not meant to be seated here in first class." Sarah glanced at the man's boarding pass and replied smoothly, "Mr. Miller is in the correct seat, ma'am. He's booked for 12B. Victoria blinked, momentarily stunned. "Well, that's impossible," she snapped, lowering her voice just enough to sound condescending without being outright rude, though anyone within 3 rows could still hear. "He clearly doesn't belong here. Did he use airline miles? Is this one of those charity upgrades? Because I pay full fare for privacy and professionalism, not to sit next to casual travelers." Jake Miller, the man in question, looked up from his screen for the first time, his gaze calm and unreadable. "I paid for my ticket," he said simply. His voice wasn't defensive, just quiet and firm, with a self-assurance that didn't match his attire. Victoria huffed and turned back toward her seat, muttering under her breath. The social hierarchy she depended on had already been violated, and the flight hadn't even left the tarmac. To her, image was everything, and right now it felt like her first-class experience had been downgraded simply by proximity. Still, the attendants didn't budge, and Jake resumed his quiet work, utterly unfazed. It was the kind of composure that annoyed her even more than his presence. As the final boarding announcements echoed through the cabin, Victoria snapped a photo of her new seatmate, careful to make it look like she was adjusting her phone, and sent it to her assistant with the caption, "Can you believe they let people like this into first class now? Standards are slipping. Remind me to look into alternative carriers for next quarter." Little did she know that the man sitting next to her, the one she had dismissed without a second thought, was about to upend her carefully curated world. What began as a simple flight from Dubai to London would soon become a lesson in humility, character, and what it truly meant to belong in first class. Victoria Chandler sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed and lips pursed, as the final passengers trickled into the first-class cabin. Jake Miller, still completely at ease, had returned to reviewing what appeared to be financial reports on his tablet, occasionally adjusting his posture but otherwise unfazed by her cold glances. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisle, helping others stow their carry-ons and offering pre-departure beverages. Victoria accepted another glass of champagne, sipping it with the theatrical elegance of someone used to being seen. She couldn't resist one more attempt to correct what she saw as a glaring misstep in cabin protocol. "I'm sure you understand," she said with a patronizing tone to Sarah, the flight attendant, "that first class is an experience we pay for, not just in ticket price, but in expectations. Comfort, class." Her voice dripped with subtle implication as she glanced again at Jake's plain t-shirt and scuffed shoes. Jake, overhearing the remark, said nothing at first. He simply glanced toward her with the faintest smile before returning to his screen. "I understand, ma'am," he said calmly. "Everyone values their travel experience differently." His voice was steady and respectful, but his composure somehow made Victoria bristle even more. She was accustomed to being feared, admired, or at least flattered, not met with detached politeness from someone she had already written off. To her, silence was not grace, it was defiance. "Tell me," she said, not looking at him directly, "did you win some kind of raffle? Or was it one of those frequent flyer upgrades? I've always thought it's a little Perseus, how the airlines hand out first-class seats like party favors these days." Jake set his tablet down gently on his tray, turning to face her for the first time with measured clarity. "I paid for my seat, Ms. Chandler. Just like you." There was no edge to his voice, no sarcasm, just truth. The simplicity of his response only deepened her irritation. It wasn't the words, it was the certainty behind them. She couldn't understand how someone dressed like him could feel so unaffected in a space that, in her mind, required grooming, pedigree, and power. Determined to regain control of the narrative, she turned her body slightly, adjusting her posture to better face the other passengers in the cabin, particularly the man across the aisle. Brandon Whitaker, a name that carried weight on Wall Street and beyond. Brandon was the CEO of Whitaker Capital, known for his strategic acquisitions and keynote appearances at international summits. Victoria had long admired Brandon's sharp business acumen and, more importantly, his influence. She had hoped to use this flight to strike up a conversation, maybe even plant the seeds for a future collaboration. But now, with Jake seated beside her like a stain on her social canvas, she feared the optics were ruined. Still, she pressed on. "Mr. Whitaker," she said warmly across the aisle, raising her voice slightly to draw his attention, "I was just reading about your recent expansion into Singapore. Truly impressive numbers." Brandon looked up, mildly surprised but courteous. "Thank you," he said simply, though his eyes briefly flicked between Victoria and Jake, clearly aware of the tension. She leaned slightly toward him, continuing, "I'd love to compare notes sometime. I'm hosting a dinner with several fund managers in May. Perhaps we could coordinate schedules?" Jake turned back to his work, clearly uninterested in the performance unfolding beside him. Victoria, now fully immersed in her own act, angled her phone toward Brandon, showing off photos from luxury events, her arm draped over the shoulders of influential figures in finance and tech. "We were all at the Monaco summit last month." These are the kinds of connections that matter when navigating high-stakes negotiations. Her voice was polished, but her eyes darted back to Jake, hoping he would feel out of place, small even. Instead, he simply accepted a hot towel from a passing flight attendant with a quiet "thank you" and continued working. The contrast between his serenity and her theatrics was becoming more and more obvious to those seated nearby. A few seats down, another passenger lowered his newspaper slightly to observe the exchange, and a young woman with earbuds in subtly glanced up from her book. The energy in the cabin was shifting, though Victoria remained oblivious to it. She had lived so long inside a world that equated visibility with success and noise with relevance that she couldn't recognize the quiet power seated beside her. To her, Jake's silence was a void she had to fill with projection, assumptions, and control. And so she leaned in closer to Brandon with a smug smile, saying just loud enough for others to hear, "You can always tell who truly belongs in first class. Not just by the ticket, but by the polish. Some things can't be faked." And yet, even as she spoke, Victoria failed to notice that the man she was trying to undermine had not once tried to match her energy. He hadn't defended himself, boasted, or even acknowledged her attempts to diminish him. Jake's presence wasn't just calm, it was intentional. And while Victoria worked to inflate her own image, he continued to shrink her assumptions, with nothing more than silence and subtle strength. In her desperation to assert dominance, she didn't realize she had already lost the room. Because power, real power, never has to announce itself. It simply exists, and eventually, it is recognized. Lunch service began with the gentle clinking of glassware and the low hum of the cabin staff moving down the aisle. The scent of truffle oil and slow-roasted lamb wafted through first class, accompanied by a refined ballet of porcelain plates and silver cutlery. Victoria Chandler, perched like a queen on her throne in seat 12A, adjusted her napkin with an air of ceremony. She had already scrutinized the menu, mentally pairing wines with the dishes in preparation for yet another chance to assert her superiority, not just over Jake Miller, but over anyone who might be watching. Her eyes slid toward him as the flight attendant approached. "Would you like to see our wine pairing suggestions, sir?" the attendant asked Jake with a courteous tone. Before he could answer, Victoria let out a light, dismissive laugh. "Oh, don't bother," she said, loud enough for the row ahead to hear. "I'm sure he'd be more comfortable with a light beer, or maybe a soda, right?" She turned slightly in her seat, pretending to share the joke with those around her, as if inviting the cabin into a collective eye roll. "People just aren't used to distinguishing between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy these days," she added with mock sympathy, swirling her own champagne glass theatrically. It was the kind of barb that she expected would land effortlessly, one she had used on junior associates at networking events and interns in boardrooms to great effect. But this time, there was no laughter, just a noticeable pause in the cabin's energy. Jake didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up at the flight attendant with a faint smile. "The 2010 Chateau Margaux, please, and the sea bass." His voice was calm, steady, and delivered with a confidence so effortless that it stunned Victoria into a brief silence. The flight attendant gave a respectful nod, evidently unfazed by the undercurrent of tension. Jake then turned back to his leather-bound journal, pen in hand, as though her insult had never happened. It wasn't just the wine choice, one of the most expensive on the menu. It was the way he ordered it, like someone who didn't need to prove anything. For Victoria, who had spent years mastering the art of performance, it was disarming and infuriating. Determined not to lose face, she pivoted her attention back to Brandon Whitaker, who had been quietly observing the interaction while pretending to review his documents. "You know," she said, projecting her voice again, "my assistant once tried to impress a client by ordering an expensive wine. Poor thing, didn't even know how to hold a glass properly." She laughed again. "Alone this time. We had to let him go, of course. Presentation is everything in our world." But her delivery rang hollow, her laughter tinny and out of sync with the moment. Across the aisle, Brandon raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond, instead returning to his notes, a subtle shift that Victoria didn't yet interpret as retreat. She pressed on, undeterred. "In our business," she continued, aiming her voice toward Brandon, "first impressions and appearances are half the negotiation. You can always spot the serious players." Again, she gestured vaguely in Jake's direction, though her words were starting to feel less like clever barbs and more like desperate distractions. Jake, for his part, didn't react. He sipped his wine, jotted something in his journal, and offered no acknowledgement of her continued commentary. That silence, again, spoke volumes, so much that it began to fill the cabin more loudly than any insult Victoria could muster. By the time the main course was served, a quiet but unmistakable shift had settled into the air. Victoria had entered this flight intending to control the room, to position herself as the alpha in a space she believed was hers by birthright. But now, as Jake carried himself with quiet confidence and Brandon's attention visibly drifted away from her forced charm, she was beginning to sense a power she couldn't manipulate. Her attempts at witty condescension were no longer being met with admiration, but instead with measured indifference, or, worse, judgment. And yet, she couldn't stop. The show had begun, and Victoria Chandler had always believed she was the star. What she hadn't realized was that the audience had already chosen a different protagonist. As the flight cruised over the Arabian Peninsula, Victoria Chandler doubled down on her campaign to assert dominance. The more Jake Miller remained quiet and self-possessed, the more desperate she became to break through his composure. Unable to elicit a reaction through wine jabs or veiled insults, she turned to her most trusted tool: status. With the seat tray cleared and dessert service still an hour away, Victoria opened the photo gallery on her phone and tilted it just enough for Jake, and anyone else glancing over, to see a curated collection of her world. Gala dinners with tech moguls, champagne toasts on private yachts, and handshakes with heads of state at the Monaco Economic Forum. "This one," she said casually, tapping on a photo where she stood beside 3 billionaires, "was taken during last month's Energy Summit. Very hush-hush. We were finalizing a deal for a new international fund. NDA-level stuff." Jake looked up, offered a polite nod, then returned to writing in his journal. But Victoria wasn't finished. She scrolled to another photo of herself boarding a private jet, her Louis Vuitton luggage perfectly staged on the tarmac. "Commercial flights are so unpredictable," she said. "But when you're flying to Geneva for an emergency board meeting, efficiency matters. That's why I maintain my own aircraft. It's just easier when you move at this level." She glanced at him with a smirk, as if waiting for an admiring comment, but Jake didn't bite. Instead, he calmly uncapped his pen and kept writing. The lack of visible envy seemed to agitate her more than outright defiance. Her eyes shifted to his gear, an older model MacBook covered in worn startup stickers, a soft leather notebook, and a generic ballpoint pen. "That laptop," she said with a light chuckle. "It reminds me of what our interns used to bring in during orientation. Vintage vibe, I suppose." She leaned back in her seat, adjusting her cashmere wrap like royalty. "And that t-shirt, I mean, it's bold, I'll give you that." "I suppose tech bros are really leaning into the whole understated genius thing these days. Are you with one of those little app companies out of Austin or Denver? I keep hearing about all these new firms trying to be the next big disruptor." Jake said nothing. He didn't look insulted or embarrassed, just peaceful. That quiet neutrality only made her want to push further. "I always find it fascinating," she continued, with a tone that barely concealed her disdain, "how people mistake access for entitlement. This cabin isn't just about a seat, it's about belonging." She turned slightly in her seat, making eye contact now. "And I think deep down, people know when they don't belong. You can pay for first class, sure, but there's an energy, a standard. Those of us who are here because we've earned it, we recognize each other. The rest, well, they usually keep their heads down and stay out of the way." Her voice had dropped slightly, as if delivering a quiet warning, an attempt to nudge him back into submission, or at least discomfort. But Jake's body language didn't shift. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a passing thought. Victoria misread the gesture as validation. Encouraged, she turned toward the aisle and addressed Brandon Whitaker again. "Don't you agree, Brandon?" she called out, her tone artificially light. "There's a decorum to first class, isn't there? An unspoken understanding that we've all arrived, not just physically, but socially." Brandon glanced over the top of his reading glasses, his expression unreadable. "I think civility is what defines a space," he said carefully, regardless of attire or background. It was a subtle but unmistakable rebuke, though Victoria didn't quite absorb it. She took another sip of champagne, convinced she was still in control of the room, still the main character in a narrative she was writing in real time. But outside of her tightly wound bubble, the atmosphere was shifting. Flight attendants moved with a noticeable tension. A young couple across the aisle exchanged glances. Even the once indifferent passengers now gave occasional sidelong looks, subtly acknowledging the imbalance of energy between the two seatmates. Victoria remained unaware. In her mind, she was still educating Jake, still setting the record straight about how the world worked. But what she didn't see, what she couldn't see, was that every sentence she uttered, every name she dropped, every boast she made, was quietly stripping her of credibility. And in the seat beside her, the man she believed to be beneath her was slowly becoming the one everyone else was watching. It happened quickly, but not without notice. Somewhere over Eastern Europe, as the cabin lights dimmed for the lunch service cleanup, a flight attendant carrying a tray of drinks stumbled in the narrow aisle. A pocket of turbulence had caught her off guard, and the tray lurched violently in her hands. A glass of red wine tumbled, hitting the carpet with a soft splash, followed by a chorus of gasps. For a brief moment, all eyes in first class turned toward the scene. The tray hit the floor, and the attendant, startled but not hurt, knelt awkwardly to collect the mess. Before any of the other passengers or crew could react, Jake Miller had already risen from his seat. Without hesitation, he stepped into the aisle, crouched beside the young attendant, and offered her a clean napkin from his seat pocket. His voice was calm and warm. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded quickly, clearly flustered but grateful. Jake helped her stabilize the tray, assisted in picking up the remaining glasses, and carefully moved a small spill kit from the galley to cover the wine stain. No grand gestures, no attention-seeking words, just quiet, effective help, given freely and without a second thought. The flight attendant thanked him with a small but genuine smile. Other passengers watched silently, many of them quietly impressed. But not Victoria Chandler. She tilted her head toward the aisle, one perfectly arched brow raised in amusement. "Well, look at that," she said loudly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Playing hero now, are we? How noble." She glanced around the cabin as if expecting others to join her in the laugh. "Some people just can't help themselves," she added, lifting her wine glass. "Always trying to win points with the staff. It's a nice gesture, I suppose, but it's not exactly the kind of thing real leaders have time for." Her tone struck a new chord, one not just dismissive, but openly bitter. The young woman across the aisle lowered her book. Brandon Whitaker looked up from his notes. No one was smiling. Jake didn't respond. He had already returned to his seat and resumed reading a technical report on his tablet. He didn't roll his eyes, didn't correct her, didn't defend himself. His stillness, as always, did the talking. But the shift in the cabin was undeniable now. It was no longer just awkward. It was reverent. People began to watch him not with curiosity, but with intrigue. He had demonstrated something in that brief moment, something Victoria's endless name-dropping and jet-setting anecdotes couldn't touch. Empathy, leadership, and an ease with people that no brand or business card could manufacture. Then, as if the universe decided to punctuate the moment, a flight attendant approached quietly with a sleek digital tablet cradled in her arms. She paused beside Jake's seat and leaned in slightly, her voice respectful but notably different from her earlier tone. "Mr. Miller," she said, "the captain asked if you'd like to visit the cockpit once we reach cruising altitude. He said it would be an honor." Jake nodded politely and offered a soft, "Thank you, I'll consider it." No explanation was given, no reason offered, but the title, Mr. Miller, carried weight now, and it didn't go unnoticed. Victoria straightened slightly, her expression faltering for the first time all flight. Something in the attendant's body language, in the formality of her approach, had unsettled her. The same man she had spent hours mocking and belittling was suddenly being addressed with the kind of deference usually reserved for heads of state or celebrities. She watched the attendant walk away, her mind turning rapidly, trying to place the name, trying to understand what was happening. Around her, the energy had changed. Eyes that once looked to Victoria were now focused on Jake, and for the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. Something had shifted in the air, and she didn't know yet just how far the ripple would spread. The moment came quietly. Not with an announcement or a fanfare, but with a single sentence that broke the tension like a glass tapping gently on crystal. Brandon Whitaker, who had remained diplomatically distant from Victoria Chandler's efforts to pull him into conversation, suddenly leaned forward. His eyes had been fixed on Jake Miller's tablet for the last several minutes, silently studying the graphs and the logo watermark visible in the corner of a financial presentation. Now, recognition dawned. "Wait a second," Brandon said, his voice laced with surprise and curiosity. "You're Jake Miller, aren't you? The CEO of Ascenza Air?" His words hung in the air like a match waiting to hit fuel. Jake looked up with a modest nod. "Yes," he replied simply, offering a small, composed smile. Brandon's eyes widened, and for the first time that flight, he closed his own laptop. "I've followed your work for years. Your AI predictive maintenance model changed the way we talk about aircraft safety. And your no-layoff policy during the pandemic, that was bold, ethical, visionary." The energy in the cabin shifted so abruptly that even Victoria could feel it in her chest. Heads turned. Conversations paused. It was as if everyone else had suddenly been let in on a secret they hadn't known they were missing. Jake Miller wasn't just a tech consultant or some startup hopeful. He was the architect of the airline they were flying on, the man who had revolutionized first-class travel, sustainability standards, and employee treatment in the aviation industry. From the seats ahead and behind, other passengers began murmuring with growing interest. A young professional, a few rows up, turned and said, "I read your piece in the Financial Review about redefining profitability beyond margins. Changed how I look at leadership." Another, a middle-aged woman in a business suit, chimed in, "My brother works for your team in Seattle. Says you know every employee by name, even the ground crew. That you still do monthly ride-alongs just to stay connected to your people." Jake nodded humbly, responding with soft gratitude, but never steering the spotlight toward himself. He answered each comment thoughtfully, speaking with humility, not the theatrical flair Victoria had been performing with all flight. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became. This wasn't just a man in jeans and a t-shirt. This was a giant in disguise. Victoria sat frozen. For a few long seconds, she didn't speak. Her mind was racing through every interaction, every insult, every smug smile she had tossed Jake's way like confetti. The mocking wine remarks, the commentary on his laptop, the assumptions about his status, they all replayed in her head with nauseating clarity. The man she had tried to publicly belittle, to diminish in front of her peers, had been quietly running the entire show from the seat beside her. She had mistaken humility for irrelevance, understated confidence for inferiority, and now, in the eyes of everyone around her, she looked not just rude, but blind to the very leadership qualities she had spent years claiming to value. As the ripple of recognition spread through the cabin, the flight crew subtly adjusted their posture. One of the senior attendants returned with a leather-bound folder. "Mr. Miller, here are the quarterly service reports you requested," she said with quiet reverence. "Also, your preferred international press selections have been placed in your seat folder." She paused before adding, "Would you like anything special brought from the galley?" Jake thanked her, declined the offer, and turned to glance briefly at Victoria. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. His eyes simply held the weight of everything unspoken. Meanwhile, Victoria's throat tightened. She tried to regain her composure, reaching for her glass, but even the champagne now tasted bitter. This wasn't a social stumble. It was a public reckoning, and it had just begun. By the time the next course was served, the dynamic in first class had entirely realigned. Jake was no longer an unknown. He was the reason the cabin existed, the mind behind the comfort, the policies, the forward-thinking strategies passengers now praised aloud. Victoria, meanwhile, had gone silent, her practiced charm replaced with a frozen smile and empty eyes. Around her, people now leaned forward, not to hear her, but to speak with Jake. The very spotlight she had tried to command had shifted decisively. And, though she was seated in the same plush leather seat, Victoria Chandler had never felt further from belonging in first class. Victoria Chandler had built her entire professional life around control. Every conversation, every boardroom interaction, every public appearance, she orchestrated them like a maestro conducting a symphony. But now, that control was slipping through her fingers faster than she could recover it. As the conversations around her shifted toward Jake Miller, with passengers praising his leadership, quoting his interviews and thanking him for policies that had personally affected their families and businesses, Victoria felt herself sinking deeper into invisibility. The worst part wasn't just the embarrassment. It was that she knew every word they spoke about him was true, and that she had spent the last 6 hours trying to humiliate him over a pair of jeans and a laptop. Desperation, however, is a powerful motivator for the prideful. Victoria straightened her posture and forced a practiced smile onto her face. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek, matte deck business card holder. With a flick of her manicured fingers, she extended a card toward Jake. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice lighter now, the sweetness forced but deliberate. "I'd love to explore potential partnerships between your airline and my firm. We've been expanding our corporate travel management division, and I think there's real synergy here. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting." She placed the card on the divider between their seats like a peace offering. Around them, the murmurs of passengers quieted, everyone listening. Jake didn't even reach for the card. Instead, he looked at it for a moment, then met her gaze with a calm that was far more cutting than anger ever could be. "That's an interesting proposal," he said slowly. "Though I admit, I'm a little unclear on your firm's policy around class hierarchy." His words were gentle, but precise, like a scalpel. "After all, you were very specific about the natural order earlier, weren't you? About who belongs in first class and who doesn't." His voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to shout. The clarity of his recall, and the fact that others had heard it too, landed like a gavel. Victoria opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. For once, her gift for spinning a narrative had abandoned her. Before the silence could settle too deeply, Victoria spotted movement in the aisle. The head purser, the same composed woman who had earlier watched the wine incident unfold, approached with a discreet but firm expression. She held a tablet in one hand and a folded note in the other. "Miss Chandler," she said in her smooth, diplomatic tone, "after reviewing recent incidents and considering overall passenger comfort, we'll need to reseat you for the remainder of the flight." Victoria blinked, her mouth slightly ajar. "Reseat?" she repeated, as though the word were foreign. "Yes," the purser replied evenly. "We have a middle seat available in row 47. Unless, of course, you would prefer to disembark at our next stop." It was like a punch to the stomach in slow motion. Victoria looked around, hoping for support, but none came. Even Brandon Whitaker, who she had tried so hard to impress, now busied himself with his iPad, not even glancing in her direction. She turned back to Jake, as if expecting a lifeline, but he remained silent, his eyes unreadable, offering her neither a smile nor a scolding. "This is outrageous," she muttered, her voice cracking slightly. "Do you know who I am?" It was a last-ditch effort, the classic line of someone who had always believed that status could rescue any situation. Jake's reply was quiet, almost gentle. "Yes, Miss Chandler," he said. "You've made it very clear who you are. And that's exactly the problem." The purser waited patiently as a second crew member began gathering Victoria's designer luggage from the overhead bin. Around them, phones tilted discreetly. Whispered conversations bloomed like wildfire across the cabin. In the age of social media, Victoria knew this would go far beyond this flight. Her brand, her boardroom presence, even her dinner invitations would all be redefined by this single episode. She stood, legs shaky, dignity unraveling with each movement, and as she made the long, humiliating walk past the very people she had tried to impress, past Jake Miller, who had quietly changed the course of her career without ever raising his voice, she realized this wasn't just a seating change. It was a reckoning. And her fall from first class wasn't about comfort. It was about character. Victoria Chandler rose from her first-class seat with the robotic grace of someone trying to maintain dignity while the ground shifted beneath her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the handle of her Louis Vuitton carry-on, but one of the flight attendants had already retrieved it, holding it just out of reach. The purser gestured politely toward the aisle, indicating the path she was to take, one she had never imagined walking. As she stepped out of the exclusive cocoon of first class, her heels clicked against the cabin floor with the weight of 1,000 judgments. She was no longer the poised executive or the high-flying socialite. She was the passenger being removed. Not for misconduct in the legal sense, but for something far more damaging in today's world. Arrogance, laid bare in public view. The walk down the aisle felt endless. She passed row after row of passengers, many of whom had already heard some version of what had happened up front. Word had traveled quickly, as it always did in enclosed spaces, especially when whispers were fueled by scandal and fueled even faster by Wi-Fi. Some passengers barely hid their amusement, whispering behind palms or nudging seatmates as she walked by. Others watched with the subtle smirk of poetic justice, eyes sparkling with recognition that karma, in all its elegant timing, had made an appearance at 35,000 feet. A teenage girl angled her phone just so, pretending to look at the seatback screen while capturing a few seconds of the unfolding scene. An older man across the aisle shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable," under his breath. Back in first class, Jake Miller sat unbothered, legs crossed, sipping water from a crystal tumbler. A flight attendant leaned down and asked softly, "Mr. Miller, we can prepare the executive suite in the forward section for you now if you'd like." Jake smiled and shook his head. "No need," he replied with calm finality. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am." Then, with a glint of dry humor in his voice, he added, "But perhaps we could send a glass of champagne to row 47. I hear we have an expert back there on wine pairings." A ripple of laughter swept through the cabin, not loud or mocking, but the kind that carries relief, justice, and irony all at once. Even Brandon Whitaker chuckled quietly into his hand, a rare show of emotion from the usually reserved executive. Victoria heard none of it, or rather, she pretended not to, but her ears burned. She felt every laugh, every whisper, every sideways glance. By the time she reached the economy section, a flight attendant pointed her toward a middle seat between a teenager in headphones and a talkative grandmother flipping through a travel magazine. The seat was narrow, the air was warmer. The privacy she once took for granted had vanished. As she settled into the tight space, the flight crew moved on as if nothing had happened. But the moment had already taken on a life of its own. Someone had posted a blurry shot to social media, captioned, "When you try to school the CO and get schooled instead, first class humbling." Within minutes, the post began to spread, liked, reshared, and commented on in real time. In row 47, Victoria sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, unable to focus on the hum of the cabin or the movie flickering across the shared screen. She was consumed by replay after replay of her own behavior. Every smug comment, every sideways glance, every laugh at Jake's expense. All of it looped in her mind like a cruel highlight reel. What haunted her most wasn't the seating downgrade or the public embarrassment. It was how completely wrong she had been. About him, about herself, about everything she thought made someone valuable. Around her, economy class hummed with its own rhythm. Children crying, couples laughing, meal carts rattling down the aisle. But Victoria felt like she was in a vacuum, sealed inside the echo of her own disgrace. Back in first class, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a cold, stiff cabin now felt energized, unified. Jake, in his jeans and soft grey t-shirt, was surrounded by passengers eager to talk, not because of his power, but because of the quiet way he had wielded it. The man Victoria had tried to shame had become the quiet hero of the flight. And she, once the self-proclaimed curator of excellence, now sat in silence at the back of the plane. The moment had crystallized into legend, an airborne parable of humility, dignity, and the dangers of mistaking appearance for worth. As Jake returned to his reading, a flight attendant delivered a fresh glass of champagne to his tray table. "Compliments of row 47, she joked softly. He smiled but said nothing. The laughter that followed, light and knowing, would echo far beyond this flight. and in Victoria Chandler's mind, for a long, long time. The final hour of the flight passed in uneasy silence for Victoria Chandler. Seated between two strangers in the cramped middle seat of row 47, she had long since stopped pretending to read the in-flight magazine or browse the outdated film selection on the overhead monitor. Her body was still, but her mind raced in loops of regret and realization. She'd always prided herself on being calculated and composed, yet nothing in her vast career had prepared her for the quiet humiliation she'd just endured, or the revelation that her judgment of others had been so fundamentally flawed. As the captain announced their gradual descent into London, the overhead chime barely registered in her ears. She sat hollowed out, clutching her armrests like they were the only solid things left in her world. A soft knock on her consciousness came in the form of a familiar flight attendant's voice. Miss Chandler," the woman said gently, offering a sealed envelope. "Mr. Miller asked that this be delivered to you before landing." Victoria looked up, stunned for a moment. Her fingers hesitated before accepting the envelope, her pride and shame warring behind her eyes. The paper was thick, luxurious, the kind reserved for formal letters or legal agreements. She broke the seal slowly, uncertain whether the contents would be a final rebuke or some formal notice of blacklisting. But what she found instead left her speechless. Inside was a handwritten note, penned in neat, thoughtful strokes. Not from a PR team, not a copied statement, but from Jake Miller himself. "Miss Chandler," it began, "true success is never measured by where we sit on a plane, but by how we treat people who can't help us climb. You made judgments about me today based on clothing, technology, and appearance. And yes, I listened to every word. But I also believe in something more powerful than public shaming. I believe in second chances. Because someone once gave one to me." Her eyes moved slowly over the sentences, absorbing each word like medicine she didn't know she needed. "We run a mentorship program at a center for underserved youth interested in aviation and business. We pair them with professionals who can offer both skill and story. Your experience could help. If you're open to learning as much as you teach, I'd like to invite you to be a part of it." Victoria blinked hard. The plane was descending rapidly now, and the lights above them flickered to life as flight attendants made their final rounds. She read the letter again, slower this time, as if trying to convince herself it was real. There was no sarcasm in Jake's message, no superiority, just a quiet offer, an open hand. He had every right to leave her with nothing but shame, to use his status to ensure she never showed her face in corporate circles again, and yet he chose grace. He chose redemption. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in years she felt something unfamiliar creeping into her carefully maintained composure. Humility. She clutched the letter to her chest as the wheels touched down on the runway, the sudden jolt grounding more than just the plane. It grounded her, too. Her mind flashed through scenes from her past, boardrooms, luxury lounges, carefully cultivated events. And suddenly, all of it felt hollow compared to the handwritten letter now warming her palm. As passengers unbuckled their belts and stood to retrieve luggage, Victoria remained seated, letting them go ahead. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone else. But for her, it was monumental. A shift. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel the need to be first. As she stood and walked toward the exit, the note still tucked securely in her hand, Victoria noticed the same flight attendant waiting near the front with a small smile. "If you're interested," the woman said softly, "I've included the mentorship details inside the envelope." Victoria nodded, unable to find her voice just yet. She turned her head and caught a final glimpse of Jake, still in his simple grey t-shirt, still speaking with a group of young entrepreneurs seated nearby. He didn't glance at her. He didn't need to. His message had already reached her, and in that moment, Victoria Chandler realized something that would stay with her long after the jet bridge connected and the cabin emptied. The most valuable upgrade she'd ever received wasn't her first-class seat, it was a second chance. The community centre in East London stood modestly against the grey backdrop of aging brick buildings and city bus stops. It wasn't the kind of place Victoria Chandler would have ever set foot in before, not in her previous life. Yet, on a brisk Saturday morning, weeks after her infamous flight, there she stood, clutching a reusable canvas bag filled with notebooks, printed slides, and a thermos of coffee she'd brewed herself. Gone were the designer heels and power suits, replaced by a simple blouse, loose trousers, and flats comfortable enough to walk several blocks in. The only accessory she wore was a slim silver bracelet. No brand, no diamonds, just something her mother had once given her, a small reminder of humility. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door, entering a space where her name meant nothing, and that was exactly the point. Inside, rows of plastic chairs were filled with eager teenagers, notebooks open, eyes wide. These were young people who had faced more hardship by age 17 than she had in her entire polished career. Yet they were hopeful, ambitious, and hungry to learn. Victoria was introduced not as an executive or a strategist, but as Miss Chandler, a volunteer mentor. No one clapped, no one Googled her, and she was grateful for that. When she began to speak, she avoided buzzwords and rehearsed monologues. Instead, she shared a real story about a mistake, a lesson, and a letter that changed her life. The room grew quiet as she spoke, not because she demanded attention, but because her honesty disarmed them. She didn't pretend to be a hero. She admitted to being wrong, and in that admission, she found the first taste of respect that came without fear or flattery. As the weeks went on, Victoria became a regular at the centre. She arrived early to set up chairs, stayed late to answer questions, and learned to laugh again. Genuinely, freely. The students started opening up to her, not because of her title, but because she listened. There was Jamal, who dreamed of being an aircraft engineer, but didn't know where to start. Priya, who was the first in her family to consider university, yet doubted she was smart enough. And Ellie, painfully shy, whose sketches of airplane interiors caught Victoria's eye one day and left her stunned. With each session, Victoria found herself growing too, not in reputation, but in depth. She no longer led by command, she led by presence. She offered guidance not from a pedestal, but from a shared place of discovery. And the students, in turn, taught her things her boardroom never could. One Saturday afternoon, Jake Miller stopped by unannounced. Dressed, as always, in casual attire, he slipped into the back of the room, while Victoria led a workshop on negotiation. She didn't see him at first. She was too focused on helping Jamal refine his pitch. But when the session ended and the students dispersed into smaller groups, she caught his eye. For a moment, she froze. Then she smiled. A real smile. Jake approached with a quiet nod. "That was impressive," he said, gesturing toward the whiteboard filled with brainstorming diagrams. "They trust you." Victoria glanced back at the students, now animatedly debating ideas for a group project. "I trust them," she replied softly. "They've taught me more than I ever expected." Jake studied her for a moment, then offered a chair beside him. They sat together as the room buzzed with youthful energy. "You've changed," he said, not as an accusation, but as a recognition. Victoria nodded. "I had to," she said, her voice calm. "Not for optics, not for image, for me. I needed to be someone I could actually respect again." There was no self-pity in her tone, only truth. She glanced at Jake, expecting him to offer some corporate wisdom or motivational platitude. But he just smiled and said, "That's leadership." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Because it came not from a title, but from someone who had seen both the worst and best of her, and still offered a seat at the table. That night, as she walked home beneath the amber glow of street lamps, Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not accomplishment, not ambition, but peace. Her steps were lighter, her breath slower. The city around her no longer felt like a stage she had to dominate, but a place she could quietly belong to. In a world obsessed with upward movement, she had discovered something richer. The freedom to look inward, to reach outward, and to lift others as she walked beside them. Her second chance wasn't about reclaiming status. It was about rediscovering purpose. And in doing so, Victoria Chandler finally stepped into the most powerful version of herself, one rooted in empathy, grace, and the kind of leadership that needed no audience to matter. 1 year later, the first-class lounge at Heathrow Airport buzzed with quiet energy. Leather chairs, gleaming espresso machines, the soft hum of business travelers and families heading to faraway places. Everything was as pristine as ever. But this time, Victoria Chandler sat differently. She wasn't draped in designer labels, nor was she preoccupied with her image. She wore a navy blazer over a cotton blouse, her hair pulled back in a practical twist. On either side of her sat two wide-eyed teenagers, Amina and Kyle, both recipients of aviation scholarships through Ascensa Air's mentorship program. Their passports were new, still stiff in their hands, and their carry-ons were mismatched and frayed. But their spirits, brighter than anything in the room. They were flying first class for the very first time, and Victoria was right beside them. Not as a boss, not as a gatekeeper, but as a guide. When the flight attendant approached after takeoff, balancing a silver tray of wine glasses, Victoria gently declined. "Just sparkling water, please," she said with a smile. The attendant paused, confused. "We have a rare vintage today. Compliments of the house?" But Victoria shook her head. "I'm here to talk them through their first international experience. They don't need to watch me swirl a glass. They need someone to answer questions and remind them they belong here." She turned to Amina, who was nervously reviewing the airline's career brochures, and gently tapped a page about cabin operations. "That's the role you told me you were interested in, right?" Kyle, seated across the aisle, was already jotting notes about airport logistics. "This flight isn't about luxury," Victoria continued. "It's about learning how to fly higher in life, not just in altitude, but in character." The two students listened with a mix of admiration and disbelief. They had heard stories of Victoria, the woman who once ran global accounts, who had jets on standby, who was rumored to be untouchable. But this Victoria was different. She laughed with them. She took time to explain the seat controls and offered to swap meals if they didn't like the options. She asked about their dreams, not their grades. And when Kyle timidly asked if people would look at them strangely in first class, Victoria only smiled and said, "If they do, that's on them. This seat doesn't define you. How you treat the person across from you, that's what does." The words hit harder than any speech. It was the kind of wisdom that didn't need a podium, just presence. As the plane soared above the clouds, Victoria leaned back and gazed out the window. Below them, the Atlantic stretched endlessly. A year ago, she had sat on a flight not unlike this one. Armed with arrogance, masked in designer pride, certain of her superiority. She had looked down on people she didn't understand. But now she looked across, at two young lives blooming beside her, and she felt something more powerful than influence. She felt purpose. The journey she had taken wasn't measured in miles, but in growth. She had gone from condescension to compassion, from being feared to being trusted, and in doing so, had discovered what it meant to truly lead. The attendants began preparing the meal service, but Victoria declined again, turning instead to review Amina's resume draft and offer feedback. "You're stronger than you realize," she said softly. "Don't water yourself down to fit what people expect. Show them who you really are." Amina beamed. Kyle, overhearing, nodded silently. Across the cabin, passengers watched with curiosity, not because Victoria demanded attention, but because her presence now carried a quiet gravity, one that drew people in instead of shutting them out. It wasn't the same first-class seat she had once guarded so fiercely. It was something far better. Earned, not entitled. As the plane cut through the golden sunset, casting warm light across their row, Victoria reflected on the simple truth she had come to live by. Real elevation doesn't come from where you sit, it comes from who you lift while you rise. And on that quiet flight, with two dreamers by her side and the horizon stretching endlessly ahead, Victoria Chandler realized that she had never felt more first class in her entire life, not because of status, but because of who she had chosen to become. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey, a story not just about downfall and redemption, but about the power of humility, empathy, and transformation. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you true-to-life narratives that challenge perceptions, spark reflection, and remind us that every person has the capacity to grow beyond their mistakes. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply inspired a new perspective, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the human stories hidden beneath the surface. Because here at Deep Inside HQ, we don't just tell stories, we reveal truths.